Okay, we skipped around chapter 9. Last week we did 8 and 10. So this week we're doing chapter 9. It's about human development. It's kind of a long chapter, but we'll get through it, I believe, I hope. There we go. There you go. Cute little baby in a nest, I guess. That's what that's supposed to be. Developmental psychologists try to answer pertinent questions by studying how humans change and grow from conception through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and eventually death. They view development as a lifelong process that can be studied scientifically across three developmental domains: the physical domain, the cognitive domain, and the psychosocial development domain. Physical development involves growth and changes in the body and the brain, the senses, motor skills, and health and wellness. Cognitive development involves learning, attention, memory, language, thinking, reasoning, and creativity. Psychosocial development involves emotions, personality, and social relationships. Across these three domains, physical, cognitive, and psychosocial, the normative approach to development is discussed. This approach asks, what is normal development? In the early decades of the 20th century, normative psychologists studied large numbers of children at various ages to determine norms. For example, average ages of when children reach specific developmental milestones in each of the three domains. And as you can see, if all these kids are in the same class, you've got a lot of different sizes. I'm guessing that it's a all same classroom, but as you can see, there's some tall boys. Here's a tall girl. There's a tall girl. Here's some shorter boys. It's really hard to say how old any of these kids are. Although children develop at slightly different rates, we can use these age-related averages as general guidelines to compare children with same age peers to determine their approximate ages they should reach specific normative events called developmental milestones. For example, when did you start crawling? When did you start walking, riding, dressing, naming colors, speaking in sentences, and starting puberty? Not all normative events are universal, meaning they are not experienced by all individuals across all cultures. Biological milestones such as puberty tend to be universal, but social milestones such as the age when children begin formal schooling are not necessarily universal. Instead, they affect most individuals in a particular culture. For example, in developed countries, children begin school around 5 or 6 years old, but in developing countries like Nigeria, children often enter school at an advanced age, if at all. Continuous development views development as a cumulative process gradually improving on existing skills. With this type of development, there is gradual change. Consider, for example, a child's physical growth adding inches to height year by year. In contrast, theorists who view development as discontinuous believe that development takes place in unique stages. It occurs at specific times or ages. With this type of development, the change is more sudden, such as an infant's ability to conceive object permanence. Stage theories hold that the sequence of development is universal. Infants in all cultures coo before they babble. Cooing involves pronouncing vowels, making the vowel sounds, and babbling is adding consonant sounds to the vowel sounds. They begin babbling at about the same age and utter their first word around 12 months old. Yet we live in diverse contexts that have a unique effect on each of us. Researchers once believed that motor development follows one course for all children, regardless of culture. However, child care practices vary by culture, and different practices have been found to accelerate or inhibit achievement of developmental milestones such as sitting, crawling, and walking. Are we who we are because of nature, biology, and genetics, or are we who we are because of nurture, our environment, and our culture? This long-standing question is known in psychology as the nature versus nurture debate. It seeks to understand how our personalities and traits are the product of our genetic makeup and biological factors, and how they are shaped by our environment, including our parents, peers, and culture. We are all born with specific genetic traits inherited from our parents, such as eye color, height, and certain personality traits. Beyond our basic genotype, however, there is a deep interaction between our genes and our environment. Our unique experiences in our environment influence whether and how particular traits are expressed, and at the same time, our genes influence how we interact with our environment. Sigmund Freud, who lived between 1856 and 1939, believed that personality develops during early childhood. For Freud, childhood experiences shape our personalities and behavior as adults. Freud viewed development as discontinuous. He believed that each of us must pass through a series of stages during childhood, and that if we lack proper nurturance and parenting during a stage, we may become stuck or fixated in that stage. And of course, these are examples of psychological fixations. The oral stage, if you have an oral fixation, you might be a smoker, you might be a gum chewer or a nail biter. If you are fixated in the anal stage, then orderliness is important to you, obsessiveness, and rigidity. The phallic fixations are vanity, exhibitionism, and pride. According to Freud, children's pleasure-seeking urges are focused on a different area of the body called the erogenous zone at each of the 5 stages of development. They start out with the oral stage, where if they don't eat, they die. So everything goes into the mouth. Then you need to potty train, and that becomes the most important thing to you is potty training, and that is the anal stage. The next stage is you discover that you are different, so that you have body parts. This is called the phallic stage. The 4th stage he referred to as a latency stage. This was a stage where nothing was going on as far as your psychosexual development was concerned. And this lasted until puberty, and puberty is what then you start noticing who you are physically attracted to. Through this whole process, the libido was the driving force. That was energy. It was this sexual need that you had, but each sexual need didn't have anything to do with fornication. Didn't have anything to do with sexual manipulation. It had to do with focusing on a select area of your body, like your mouth, and then depositing your waste in the right spot. And then, of course, this didn't really have anything to do with sex, and certainly this didn't have anything to do with sex. Your latency stage, when you don't even think about sex, and then all of a sudden sex becomes extremely important. And that's after you go through puberty, after you go through puberty, and you start noticing somebody that you want to, or you start thinking about having sex with select individuals. The oral stage, oral phase, we fixate on the breast. What's the idea? Oh, this is if the oral stage is taken care of, and this is if the oral stage, if they do away with the oral stage too early, then we have problems. And we saw what happens if you get fixated on that stage. Whoops. You become a smoker, a gum chewer, and a nail biter. The anal stage, of course, if they support you, then everything's fine. If they give you a really hard time about potty training, then you feel guilty and you become a hoarder, or you become a obsessive compulsive, very organized, because you don't want that to ever happen. The phallic stage, you notice that you have body parts that need to be taken care of. You become, during the phallic stage, you become very possessive of your opposite sex parent, and you become afraid of your same sex parent, and you want to do away with them. This is known as the King Kong syndrome. And then you realize that, and you think that your same sex parent wants to destroy you as a sexual rival. And if you get fixated in this stage, then you become somebody who is somebody who thinks about sex a lot and is very negative about it. The latent stage, nothing's going on. People like you. Boys mess around with other boys, and they don't have anything to do with girls. And girls are the same way. They don't want to have anything to do with boys. This is when you develop your own personal autonomy. And then the genital stage, which this is a funny picture, because this guy's got his arm around her, and she's leaning on his shoulder, and she's got her hand on this other guy's leg. Anyway, and that was Sigmund Freud. Erik Erikson, who lived between 1902 and 1994, took Freud's theory and modified it as the psychosocial theory. It's kind of interesting because Erikson actually worked with Freud, and he disagreed with him. Not the easiest man to disagree with, but then when he came to the United States, this is all taking place in Europe. Erikson was German, and Freud was Austrian, and German was their primary language. Erikson actually worked with Freud and Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, and he actually worked with children. Freud never worked with children. What Freud worked with were people that had problems, people that had repressed personalities. This is what he actually worked with. And from all of these messed up people, he came up with his psychosexual theory, because in his time, if you had a problem, it was probably a sexual problem. But Erikson thought, well, wait a minute, if we use mental illness as our guide, of course we're going to find all kinds of odd things. But we need to look at children from a more positive point of view, and that's what he did. He came up with the psychosocial theory. Now, strangely enough, Erikson, who actually wasn't named Erik Erikson, his name was Erik, but his name wasn't Erikson. He had several last names. He had several last names, and his biggest problem was the fact that he was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child, and he was Jewish. And of course, Germans, wait a minute, Jewish people have dark hair and dark eyes, and they're relatively dark complexioned. And here's this Jewish kid that is looks like he's from Sweden or Norway, and so he had a hard time being in the German community, because Jewish people rejected him because he looked German, and German people rejected him because he was Jewish. So he didn't have any friends, and so society, his psychosocial upbringing was very difficult. It was extremely difficult. And then he found out that his mother, instead of being married to the man that she was, instead of giving birth to a baby from the man who she was married to when Erikson was born, she had had an affair with a Danish sea captain, and that's where he came from. His father was actually a Danish sea captain. She wouldn't tell him what the guy's name was, so Erik went looking for him. She'd actually been married a couple times. The first time, when Erikson was born, she was married to a select man, and he left her because obviously the baby wasn't his. And then she married Erickson's pediatrician, whose name was Holmberger. So Erickson's name for the longest time was Holmberger. And he traveled around to Europe, and eventually he ended up in Italy, and he learned the Montessori school system from Montessori, and then he went up to Vienna and started working with Freud and Freud's daughter. But he was working with children, so he was seeing what normal was, and of course Freud didn't deal with normal. Freud only dealt with abnormal, people with mental illness. So he came up with this psychosocial theory. But interestingly enough, this was part of his upbringing was the fact that he had such social problems because he was rejected by everybody. Uh, when the Nazis took over in Germany, um, Erickson decided he would come to the United States. And when he came to the United States, of course, he's on the ship for a couple weeks, coming to the United States, and he kept getting offers. He didn't even graduate from high school, but he had worked with Freud, so he's getting. He did all this writing, so he's getting all these offers from Yale and Harvard and Stanford. It's really kind of interesting. And he said, "I've got a surprise for you when I get there." And the surprise was he changed his name to Eric Erickson, which sounds Scandinavian, of course, but he was not Scandinavian at all. He was actually German, from Karlsruhe, Germany, which is the area of Germany that we lived in when we were stationed in Germany. And Homburg is actually a town right outside of Zweibrücken. So the pediatrician that his mother married was from Homburg, Germany, which is right there on the French border. Interesting. That's I didn't live in Homburg. I lived in Mauschbach, but it's a little town right beside Zweibrücken. As interesting as that is, what's the other thing about Erickson? Okay, so Erickson came to the United States and started working in the field, and he decided that what he needed to do in order to understand people in the United States, he needed to be around everybody in the United States, not just rich white people. So he decided that he was working at Stanford at the time. He decided he was going to work with American Indians. And he went to the Yurok tribe, which is a northern California tribe in Humboldt County, California. And he studied them, and then he realized, wait a minute, this is California. Maybe I need to look at another tribe. So he went out to South Dakota and started doing research, looking at some of the Sioux living in South Dakota. So of all the psychologists, he's the one with the most experience dealing with American Indians. Okay, so that's the story of Eric Erickson. And as you can see, you can't tell what color his eyes are, or his hair is white in this picture. While Freud believed that personality is shaped only in childhood, Erickson proposed that personality development takes place all through the lifespan. Erickson suggested that how we interact with others is what affects our sense of self, or what he called the ego identity. Erickson proposed that we are motivated by a need to achieve competence in certain areas of our lives. According to psychosocial theory, we experience 8 stages of development over our lifespan, from infancy through late adulthood. At each stage, there is a conflict or task that we need to resolve. Successful completion of each developmental task results in a sense of competence and a healthy personality. Failure to master these tasks leads to feelings of inadequacy. Now, you got to remember that Erickson pretty much grew up by himself, he and his mother, and eventually one of his stepfather. That was about it. He didn't really interact with children because he was Jewish, and he didn't really interact with Jewish people because he looked German. So he had no friends, and he grew up pretty much all by himself. According to Erickson in 1963, trust is the basis of our development during infancy, birth to 12 months. Therefore, the primary task of this stage is trust versus mistrust. Infants are dependent upon their caregivers, so caregivers who are responsive and sensitive to their infant's needs help their baby to develop a sense of trust. Their baby will see the world as a safe, predictable place. Unresponsive caregivers who do not meet their baby's needs can engender feelings of anxiety, fear, and mistrust. Their baby may see the world as unpredictable. As toddlers, ages 1 to 3, they begin to explore their world. They learn that they can control their actions and act on the environment to get results. They begin to show clear preferences for certain elements of the environment, such as food, toys, and clothing. A toddler's main task is to resolve the issue of autonomy versus shame and doubt by working to establish independence. This is the me-do-it stage. And of course, the idea of independence has something to do with being potty trained. If denied the opportunity to act on their environment, they begin to doubt their abilities, which could lead to low self-esteem and feelings of shame. Once children reach the preschool stage, ages 3 to 6 years, they are capable of initiating activities and asserting control over their world through social interactions and play. According to Erickson, preschool children must resolve the task of initiative versus guilt. By learning to plan and achieve goals while interacting with others, preschool children can master this task. Those who do will develop self-confidence and feel a sense of purpose. Those who were unsuccessful at this stage with their initiative misfiring or stifled may develop feelings of guilt. During the elementary school ages 7 through 11, children face the task of industry versus inferiority. Children begin to compare themselves to their peers to see how they measure up. They either develop a sense of pride and accomplishment in their schoolwork, sports, social activities, and family life, or they feel inferior and inadequate when they don't measure up. In adolescence, ages 12 through 18, children face the task of identity versus role confusion. According to Erickson, an adolescent's main task is developing a sense of self. Adolescents struggle with questions such as who am I and what do I want to do with my life? Along the way, most adolescents try on many different selves to see which one fits. Adolescents who are successful at this stage have a strong sense of identity and are able to remain true to their beliefs and values in the face of problems and other people's perspectives. What happens to apathetic adolescents who do not make a conscious search for identity, or those who are pressured to conform to their parents' ideas for the future? These teens will have a weak sense of self and experience role confusion. They are unsure of their identity and confused about the future. And this includes kids that are being controlled by their parents, and this also includes kids that have no direction in life. So if you're looking at somebody that's 25 years old and has never lived outside their parents' home and has no goals, and potentially they don't have a job, that's one group. The other group would be a lot of kids that I went to through college with. A lot of the individuals were very bright. They wanted to be doctors. A lot of them did become doctors, but they didn't have a drive to become a doctor. The fact that they wanted to be a doctor came from their parents. And sometimes they went all the way through medical school, hating every second of it, hating every minute of it. We talked before about work, and if you love your job, then it's not work. Well, a lot of these individuals went through medical school, they became doctors, and they just despised it. And these are the people, there's a number of them. At my college was a pre-med school, and these individuals, most of these guys are dead, and the reason they're dead is because they worked every day of their lives. And if you know, I went to all my college reunions starting my 10th reunion, I think. My 10th reunion would have been 1981. 1981, I was in Germany, so it must have been the 20th reunion. I was in Mississippi. Yeah, 20th reunion. Anyway, they looked like they were twice as old as anybody else, and you could tell which ones they were. The people that really hated what they had chosen to do in life and had never been able to get out of it. And these guys are all dead now. And the reason they are dead is because, unfortunately, they worked every day of their lives. Now, me, I haven't worked a single day in my life because I enjoy doing whatever I'm doing. People in early adulthood, that's 20s through the early 40s, are concerned with intimacy versus isolation. After we have developed a sense of self in adolescence, we are ready to share our life with others. And a lot of times, this is what happens. I have a student, is it in this class that I talked about that, or was it another class? I had a student that called me and told me that he had a job. And we've been discussing this. The poor guy, he's from Bangladesh, and he has wanted a girlfriend forever. And he's talked about it, and he's talked about it. But he hasn't been able to do it. And the reason he hasn't been able to do it is because he wanted to establish himself first. Well, he's in his early 30s, I think, and now he's established. And so I would imagine that within the next year or two, when he starts teaching, he will find himself somebody to marry, somebody that now that he has released himself from his finding himself, now he will actually be able to find a girlfriend and potentially a wife. After we have developed a sense of self in adolescence, we are ready to share our life with others, and that's what's happened with him. Erickson said that we must have a strong sense of self before developing intimate relationships with others. Adults who do not develop a positive self-concept in adolescence may experience feelings of loneliness and emotional isolation. When people reach their 40s, they enter the time known as middle adulthood, which extends to the mid-60s. The social task of middle adulthood is generativity versus stagnation. Generativity involves finding your life's work and contributing to the development of others through activities such as volunteering, mentoring, and raising children. Those who do not master this task may experience stagnation, having little connection with others, and little interest in productivity and self-improvement. From the mid-60s to the end of your life, we are in a period of development known as late adulthood. That's where I am. I'm 71 years old, so I'm well beyond, what is it? I'm well beyond generativity versus stagnation. Erickson's task at this stage is called integrity versus despair. He said that people in late adulthood reflect on their lives and feel either a sense of satisfaction or a sense of failure. People who feel proud of their accomplishments feel a sense of integrity, and they can look back on their lives with few regrets. However, people who are not successful at this stage may feel as if their life has been wasted. They focus on what would have, should have, and could have been. They face the end of their lives with feelings of bitterness, depression, and despair. Jean Piaget, who lived between 1896 and 1980, is another stage theorist who studied children's cognitive development. Cognitive growth, excuse me. He believed that thinking is a central aspect of development and that children are naturally inquisitive. However, he said that children do not think and reason like adults. His theory of cognitive development holds that our cognitive abilities develop through specific stages, which exemplifies the discontinuity approach to development. As we progress to a new stage, there is a distinct shift in how we think and reason. Piaget is really kind of interesting because Piaget is Swiss, but he's from the French Swiss region where they speak primarily French, and he wrote in French. And because he wrote in French, and because the people in the United States were not real happy with the French for no reason whatsoever after World War II. Uh, nobody read Piaget until the 1970s. This is really weird because I started in psychology. I started studying psychology in 1975, and I had never heard of Piaget until probably sometime in the middle to late 80s, despite the fact that he had been writing for 40 or 50 years. And Europeans swore by this guy, but Americans who don't read French never read anything about Piaget. They also didn't read anything about Vygotsky, and we'll talk about Vygotsky in just a second. But they didn't. So it wasn't until the middle 80s that people started talking about Piaget. Before that, if we're talking about educational psychology, we're talking about Erikson and his stages. We weren't talking about the cognitive development of children, and it wasn't until the middle 80s that we started doing that. As stupid as that sounds, here's this really good idea that everybody is on board with now, but we wouldn't read the guy because he was French, and people didn't like. For one thing, they didn't write. They couldn't read French. They couldn't speak French, and they didn't want to know anything about people that wrote in French. As stupid as that sounds. Piaget said that children develop schemata to help them understand the world. Schemata are concepts, mental models that are used to help us categorize and interpret information. By the time children have reached adulthood, they have created schemata for almost everything. And this is how we do things. This is how we do. Okay. Anyway. So we have schemata for like everything. We have schemata for going to the grocery store. We have schemata for going to the restaurant. We have schemata for dealing with our relatives and in-laws. We have schemata, and we create these on a continual basis. When children learn new information, they adjust their schemata through two processes, assimilation and accommodation. First, they assimilate new information or experiences in terms of their current schemata. Assimilation is when you take in information that is comparable to what they already know. So when I got married for the first time, I was trying to deal with my in-laws, and I was trying to deal with my in-laws using the idea of this is what they want. This is what they want because this is what my parents want. That's a family, and I have a family, and I know how to deal with my own family. And so I tried to assimilate the new information. They were all girls in that family, and we were 4 boys and two girls. So it was a lot different. There were 4 daughters in that family, the mother and the father, of course. So that's 5 women and one male in the household, and it was really kind of interesting. He stayed in the garage most of the time because he didn't want to deal with all the other strange things that were going on. And in my family, it was not that way at all. We all just kind of stayed around each other, and in their household, they expected men to be seen and not heard primarily. So it was difficult for me to assimilate that information. And of course, eventually we got a divorce because as far as they were concerned, women are always in charge. So when we kind of knocked heads, my idea was, you compromise, but their idea was that whatever the woman wanted is what needed to happen. So I was in the military, and my first wife decided that I should get out of the military and go into the factory, start working in a factory. And I couldn't do that. You sign up for 4 years, you're in for 4 years. You can't do anything for 4 years. And of course, before my first tour was up, she had left me with the kids. Accommodation describes when they change their schemata based on new information. This process continues as children interact with their environment And that's what I needed to do. I needed to accommodate, I needed to create a new schemata when dealing with that family. Piaget thought development unfolds in a series of stages approximately associated with age ranges. He proposed a theory of cognitive development that unfolds in 4 stages: the sensorimotor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. The first stage is the sensorimotor stage, which lasts from birth to about 2 years. During this stage, children learn about the world through their senses and motor behavior. Young children put objects in their mouths to see if the items are edible, and once they can grasp objects, they may shake or bang them to see if they make sounds. Between 5 and 8 months, the child develops object permanence, which is the understanding that even if something is out of sight, it still exists. According to Piaget, young infants do not remember an object after it has been removed from their sight. Piaget studied infants' reactions when a toy was first shown to an infant and then hidden under a blanket. Infants who had already developed object permanence would reach for the hidden toy, indicating that they knew it still existed, whereas infants who had not developed object permanence would appear confused. During late sensorimotor stage, children begin to exhibit stranger anxiety, which is a fear of unfamiliar people. Babies may demonstrate this by crying and turning away from a stranger, by clinging to a caregiver, or by attempting to reach their arms toward familiar faces, such as parents. Stranger anxiety results when a child is unable to assimilate the stranger into an existing schema. Therefore, they can't predict what their experience with their stranger will be like, which results in a fear response. Piaget's second stage is a preoperational stage, which is from approximately 2 to 7 years old. In this stage, children can use symbols to represent words, images, and ideas, which is why children in this stage engage in pretend play. Children also begin to use language in the preoperational stage, but they cannot understand adult logic or mentally manipulate information. The term operational refers to logical manipulation of information, so children at this stage are considered to be pre-operational. And this is an interesting picture over here. This is a little girl, and she is a princess, and she has changed her brother into a cat. And here she is playing with her brother. As interesting as that is, that's what the picture said. Children's logic is based on their own personal knowledge of the world so far, rather than on conventional knowledge. Children in this stage cannot perform mental operations because they have not developed an understanding of conservation, which is the idea that even if you change the appearance of something, it is still equal in size as long as nothing has been removed or added. During this stage, we also expect children to display egocentrism, which means that the child is not able to take the perspective of others. A child at this stage thinks that everyone sees, thinks, and feels just as they do. An egocentric child is not able to infer the perspective of other people and instead attributes his own or their own perspective. And this is egocentrism. What he did was the 3 mountain experiment. He had 3 mountains sitting there, and he asked the little girl what somebody on the other side of the table saw. And if egocentrism was in place, she assumed that they saw what she saw. But if as soon as egocentrism loses its power, then they are able to see from another person's perspective. And at that stage, they move to the next stage. Piaget's third stage is a concrete operational stage, which occurs from about 7 to 11 years old. In this stage, children can think logically about real, concrete events. They have a firm grasp on the use of numbers and start to employ memory strategies. They can perform mathematical operations and understand transformations, such as addition is the opposite of subtraction, and multiplication is the opposite of division. In this stage, children also master the concept of conservation. Even if something changes shape, its mass, volume, and number stay about the same. And that's what we are dealing with here. Which glass has more liquid in it? And the answer is they both have exactly the same amount. Children in the concrete operational stage understand the principle of reversibility, which means that objects can be changed and then returned back to their original form or condition. Take, for example, water. You can pour water from a fat glass back to the thin glass and still have the same amount minus a couple of drops. The fourth and last stage in Piaget's theory is the formal operational stage, which is from about age 11 to adulthood. Children in the formal operational stage can deal with abstract ideas and hypothetical situations. Children in this stage can use abstract thinking to problem solve, look at alternative solutions, and test these solutions. In adolescence, a renewed egocentrism occurs. Many developmental psychologists disagree with Piaget, suggesting a fifth stage of cognitive development known as the postformal stage. In postformal thinking, decisions are made based on situations and circumstances, and logic is integrated with emotion as adults develop principles that depend on contexts. One way that we can see the difference between an adult in postformal thought and an adolescent in formal operations is in the terms of how they handle emotionally charged issues. Once we reach adulthood, our problem-solving abilities change. As we attempt to solve problems, we tend to think more deeply about many areas of our lives, such as relationships, work, and politics. Because of this, postformal thinkers are able to draw on past experiences to help them solve new problems. Problem-solving strategies using postformal thought vary depending on the situation. And now we're going to talk about Lev Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian psychologist who proposed a sociocultural theory of development. Now, what was wrong with Vygotsky? Vygotsky was a Russian, and this was after World War I and through World War II. Actually, he died in the 1930s. But he wrote his theories in the 1920s. So why didn't we adhere to them? Why didn't we read them? Well, it's because we were mad at the Russians. The Russians pulled out of World War I, and because of that, the Germans almost won the war. If it hadn't been for the United States joining the war in 1917, then probably the Germans would have run over the Belgians, the French, and the English, and they wouldn't have been able to keep the Germans out of France. That's because the Russians pulled out. And then the Russians were communists. They were Bolsheviks. And of course, that made everybody angry, made Europeans especially angry because there were a lot of monarchies in Europe. And the Bolsheviks didn't believe in that. They had just overthrown the Tsar. So that was what was going on. Then during World War II, the Russians were actually our allies, and the Russians actually defeated the Germans. We defeated the Japanese. They defeated the Germans with our help, of course, a lot of our help. But after the war, the communists, the idea of communism became very negative in a lot of in Western Europe and in the United States. So once again, we hated the Russians. And at that point, the Cold War started. The Cold War lasted until probably 1989, from 1945 to 1989, 40 years of Cold War. So the whole point is, Vygotsky writes this brilliant theory, and nobody was listening to him outside of Russia because he was Russian. And that's pretty much it. Now that the wall has come down and the Soviet Union is Russia, we're not so upset with ideas coming out of that country. And then we started reading him and going, this makes a lot of sense. Anyway, that's Lev Vygotsky. He suggested that human development is rooted in one's culture. A child's social world forms the basis for the formation of language and thought. The language one speaks and the ways a person thinks about things is dependent on one's cultural background. Vygotsky also considered historical influences as key to one's development. He was interested in the process of development and the individual's interactions with their environment. A major task of beginning in childhood and continuing into adolescence is discerning right from wrong. Psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, who only lived for 60 years, extended upon the foundation that Piaget built regarding cognitive development. Kohlberg believed that moral development still, like cognitive development, follows a series of stages. This is interesting because Kohlberg was from Harvard. Kohlberg was from Harvard, and there were people at Harvard that didn't like what he said, and we're going to talk about those people in just a second. And this is, so he decided that he was going to do research, and this was the dilemma he came up with, trying to find out how people's moral development worked. Whoops, sorry. It was known as Heinz's moral dilemma. In Europe, a woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. There was one drug that the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. How lucky is that? The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $200 for the radium and charged $2,000 for a small dose of the drug. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half of what it cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. But the druggist said, "No, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it." So Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should the husband have done that? That's it. That's Heinz's moral dilemma. After presenting people with this and various other moral dilemmas, Kohlberg reviewed people's responses and placed them in different stages of moral reasoning. According to Kohlberg, an individual progresses from the capacity for pre-conventional morality before age 9 to the capacity for conventional morality, early adolescence, and toward attaining post-conventional morality once formal operational thought is attained, which only a few fully achieve. Kohlberg placed in the highest stage responses that reflected the reasoning that Heinz should steal the drug because his wife's life is more important than the pharmacist making money. The value of a human life overrides the pharmacist's greed. Kohlberg's theory. Okay, so the first one, rules are fixed and absolute. That's the first stage. The second, judging actions according to individual needs. The third is conforming and being nice. The fourth is respecting authority. And the last is considering individual rights. And this is a picture of a man stealing bread to feed these young children, in which case it's all right. It is important to realize that even those people who have the most sophisticated post-conventional reasons for some choices may make other choices for the simplest of pre-conventional reasons. Many psychologists agree with Kohlberg's theory of moral development, but point out that moral reasoning is very different from moral behavior. Kohlberg in 1969 felt that more males than females move past stage 4 in their moral development. He went on to note that women seem to be deficient in their moral reasoning abilities. Well, this really pissed off this lady right here. This is Carol Gilligan. And Gilligan went up to a girls' school up in New Hampshire and did research and discovered that females have just as much moral reasoning as males do. That's what she determined. She criticized her former mentor, and actually she was a student of his. and worked in the same department that he did. Uh, she criticized reform and mentor's theory because it was based only on upper class white men and boys. And that's one of the problems we have with research. Sometimes it just reflects one small group. And in his case, he was dealing with people that worked at MIT, people who worked at Harvard. Uh, he was dealing with a very elite group of white males primarily. But Gilligan argued that girls and women focus more on staying connected and the importance of interpersonal relationships. Okay, so we're not going to talk about moral development anymore. We're going to impregnate somebody. Here we go. There's the sperm flying into the egg, and there we go. It has happened. A mother and father's DNA is passed on to the child at the moment of conception, and that's what's happening. Haploid. Conception occurs when a sperm fertilizes an egg and forms a zygote. And that's the first thing that happens. Now we have two different structures of DNA. Haploid, there we go. So we've got a sperm, we've got an egg, and the one makes it inside. And now the woman is pregnant. A zygote begins as a one-cell structure that is created when a sperm and egg merge. The genetic makeup and sex of the baby are set at this point. During the first week after conception, the zygote divides and multiplies, going from a one-cell structure to 2 cells, then 4 cells, then 8 cells, and so on. This process of cell division is called mitosis, where it splits in half. Mitosis is a fragile process, and fewer than 1/2 of all zygotes survive beyond the first 2 weeks. After 5 days of mitosis, there are 100 cells, and after 9 months, there are billions of cells. As the cells divide, they become more specialized, forming different organs and body parts. In the germinal stage, the mass of cells has yet to attach itself to the lining of the mother's uterus. Once it becomes the next stage begins. Once it does, after it attaches itself into the mother's uterus, and this is known as the germinal stage. The embryonic stage begins right away, as soon as it attaches itself to the mother's cell wall of the uterus. After the zygote divides from about 7 to 10 days, and has 150 cells, it travels down the fallopian tubes and implants itself in the lining of the uterus. Upon implantation, this multicellular organism is called an embryo. So it starts out as a zygote, and then it becomes an embryo. Now blood vessels grow, forming the placenta. The placenta is a structure connected to the uterus that provides nourishment and oxygen from the mother to the developing embryo. Via the umbilical cord. Basic structures of the embryo start to develop into areas that will become the head, the chest, and the abdomen. During the embryonic stage, the heart begins to beat and organs form and begin to function. The neural tube forms along the back of the embryo, developing into the spinal cord and the brain. And that's what's happening here. That is the neural tube developing. As you can see, it's forming a tube. When the organism is about 9 weeks old, the embryo is called a fetus. At this stage, the fetus is about the size of a kidney bean and begins to take on the recognizable form of a human being as the tail begins to disappear. That's what, there's a tail. Here's the tail right here. And you can see the tail's going to disappear. When it first starts, it's got quite a tail going there. And the tail becomes the spinal cord. From 9 to 12 weeks, the sex organs begin to differentiate. At about 16 weeks, the fetus is approximately 4.5 inches long. Fingers and toes are fully developed, and the fingerprints are visible. By the time the fetus reaches the 6th month of development, the 24th week, it weighs up to 1.4 pounds. Hearing has developed so the fetus can respond to sounds. The internal organs such as the lungs, the heart, the stomach, and intestines, have formed enough that a fetus born prematurely at this point has a chance to survive outside of the mother's womb. And I think the youngest fetus that ever survived, her picture was was on CNN the other day. She was 20 months gestation, or 20 weeks, I'm sorry, 20 weeks gestation, which is what? 20 divided by 4, and that's 5 months old when she was born, and she was able to survive. The probability of her surviving was almost nothing, but she was able to survive. Throughout the fetal stage, the brain continues to grow and develop, nearly doubling in size from weeks 16 to 28. Around 36 weeks, the fetus is almost ready for birth. It weighs about 6 pounds and is about 18 and a half inches long. And by week 37, all of the fetus's organ systems are developed enough that it could survive outside the mother's uterus without many of the risks associated with premature birth. The fetus continues to gain weight and grow in length until approximately 40 weeks. By then, the fetus has very little room to move around, and birth becomes imminent. And of course, this baby is not in the right position to be born. The baby needs to flip around, and the head needs to be next to the birth canal. During each prenatal stage, genetic and environmental factors can affect development. The developing fetus is completely dependent on the mother for life. It is important that the mother takes good care of herself and receives prenatal care, which is medical care during pregnancy that monitors the health of both the mother and the fetus. I don't know what she's drinking there. Ugh. Something green. Looks like she's eating kale. I'm not sure how good that is. I'm sure it's wonderful. The placenta provides nourishment and oxygen to the fetus. Most everything the mother ingests, including food, liquid, and even medication, travels through the placenta to the fetus. Hence the common phrase, eating for two. Anything the mother is exposed to in the environment affects the fetus. If the mother is exposed to something harmful, the child can show lifelong effects. A teratogen is any environmental agent, biological, chemical, or physical, that causes damage to the developing embryo or fetus. There are different types of teratogens. Alcohol and most drugs cross the placenta and affect the fetus. And that is kind of sad. Alcohol is not safe to drink in any amount during pregnancy. Alcohol use during pregnancy has been found to be the leading preventable cause of intellectual disability in children in the United States. Excessive maternal drinking while pregnant can cause fetal alcohol spectrum disorders with lifelong consequences for the child ranging in severity from minor to major. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders are a collection of birth defects associated with heavy consumption of alcohol during pregnancy. Physically, children with fetal alcohol syndrome spectrum disorder may have a small head size and abnormal facial features. Cognitively, these children may have poor judgment, poor impulse control, higher rates of ADHD, learning issues, and lower IQ scores. These developmental problems and delays persist into adulthood. Smoking is also considered a teratogen because nicotine travels through the placenta to the fetus. When the mother smokes, the developing baby experiences a reduction in blood oxygen levels. And this is because nicotine is a vasoconstrictor. In other words, it makes your blood vessels smaller. Well, of course, if an adult smokes a cigarette, it doesn't mean that it's not that big a deal. But this is an infant that's trying to grow, and every time the mother smokes, then the baby stops growing. Smoking while pregnant can result in premature birth, low birth weight infants, stillbirth, and sudden infant death syndrome. Heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, almost all prescription medicines, and most over-the-counter medications are also considered teratogens. Babies born with a heroin addiction need heroin just like an adult addict. And I think I told you about my niece, great-great-niece. No, my great-niece had my great-great-nephew. and she was using heroin at the time during her pregnancy, and he was born with with a heroin addiction. Took him 6 weeks to get him off of the stuff. The child will need to be gradually weaned from the heroin under medical supervision, otherwise the child could have seizures and die. And I'm not saying that women with blue hair are heroin addicts or women with that tattoo are heroin addicts, but I typed in heroin addicted baby, and this is one of the pictures that came up. Other teratogens include radiation, viruses such as HIV and herpes, and rubella. Rubella is German measles. Women in the United States are much less likely to be afflicted with rubella because most women received childhood immunizations or vaccinations that protect the body from the disease. This is what it looks like when you've got rubella, the German measles. This lady almost died from it, as weird as that is. Now, part of the problem is that we have anti-vaxxers, and they don't believe anybody should be vaccinated. And, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of children in the United States that have never been vaccinated. Now, the problem may be that when they become old enough to reproduce and have never had rubella, they've never had the measles, if they come in contact with the measles, then this is what might potentially happen. This is what the lady looked like before she got the measles. This is what she looked like afterwards. This actually left scars on her face, and she has red splotches on her face now. You know, so we may be seeing another wave of this. We almost eradicated the measles, but then people decided that it wasn't a good idea to vaccinate your children, and they got a burr in their saddle, and now we have hundreds of thousands of children that aren't vaccinated. So that's what might potentially happen. Each organ of the fetus develops during a specific period in pregnancy called the critical or the sensitive period. Research with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder has demonstrated that the time during which a developing fetus is exposed to alcohol can dramatically affect the appearance of facial characteristics associated with fetal alcohol syndrome. Specifically, this research suggests that alcohol exposure that is limited to day 19 or 20 of gestation can lead to significant facial abnormalities in the offspring. Given regions of the brain also show sensitive periods during which they are most susceptible to the teratogenergic effects of alcohol. This is really kind of interesting to me because when I was working at St. Joseph Hospital in Omaha, we were doing, this is the kind of research that was being done. I wasn't doing the research, I was working in the lab. But there was a place there called Boys Town Institute, and they were dealing with fetal alcohol syndrome, and so they were doing almost all the stuff that we're talking about as far as fetal alcohol syndrome is concerned. Has to do with the research coming out of Boys Town Institute. Boys Town Institute. Sadly, they were working with the local population, and Omaha is, or St. Joe is on the north side of Omaha, so they were dealing with African Americans. They were also dealing with American Indians from the reservations just north of there. There's a Ho-Chunk reservation. There's a Teton Sioux reservation. There's Omaha and Oto are there. Anyway, sadly they were working with those populations, and they were also working with white populations, but they were working with some minority populations as well. The average newborn weighs approximately 7.5 pounds. All healthy babies are born with newborn reflexes, inborn automatic responses to particular forms of stimulation. Reflexes help the newborn survive until it is capable of more complex behaviors. These reflexes are crucial to survival. They are present in babies whose brains are developing normally and usually disappear around 4 to 5 months old. The rooting reflex is the newborn's response to anything that touches their cheek. When you stroke a baby's cheek, they naturally turn their heads in that direction and begin to suck. The sucking reflex is the automatic, unlearned sucking motion that infants do with their mouths. Now, the interesting thing is that this isn't just sucking with their mouths. It's also they have the ability to close off the back of their mouth and to breathe through their noses while they're drinking. Now, this is don't try this at home. Don't try to drink something and breathe it through your nose at the same time, because you'll suck it down your windpipe and you'll start coughing. But they're able to do that, and they do it automatically without well, I don't know about that, without thinking part, but they do it automatically, and it's a little bit more complex than just adults sucking on something. If you put your finger into a newborn baby's hand, you will witness the grasping reflex, in which the baby automatically grasps anything that touches its palms. The Moro reflex is the newborn's response when they feel like they are falling. The baby spreads their arms, pulls them back in, and then usually cries. Newborn infants' sensory abilities are significant, but their senses are not yet fully developed. Many of the newborn's innate preferences facilitate interaction with caregivers and other humans. Although vision is their least developed sense, newborns already show a preference for faces. Babies who are just a few days old also prefer human voices. They will listen to voices longer than sounds that do not involve speech, and they seem to prefer their mother's voice over a stranger's voice. Oddly, they also prefer their father's voice, and the reason is because, especially if the mother has a really high-pitched voice, if her voice is really high, they can't actually hear it in the womb, but they can hear the deeper voices, and so when the mother's speaking in a deeper register, then they can hear that. They can also hear their father's voice, especially if their father, well, it doesn't really matter how deep. Male voices are deeper than female voices, and it's mainly because of their voice box, which is prominent in males. In infancy, toddlerhood, and early childhood, the body's physical development is rapid. On average, newborns weigh between 5 and 10 pounds, and a newborn's weight typically doubles in 6 months and triples in 1 year. By 2 years old, the weight will have quadrupled, so we can expect that a 2-year-old should weigh between 20 and 40 pounds. The average length of a newborn is 19.5 inches, increasing to 29.5 inches by 12 months and 34.4 inches by 2 years old. During infancy and childhood, growth does not occur at a steady rate. Growth slows between 4 and 6 years old. During this time, children gain 5 to 7 pounds and grow about 2 to 3 inches per year. Once girls reach 8 to 9 years old, their growth rate outpaces that of boys due to a pubertal growth spurt. This growth spurt continues until around 12 years old, coinciding with the start of the menstrual cycle. By 10 years old, the average girl weighs 88 pounds, and the average boy weighs 85 pounds. And as you can see, these girls have gone through the growth spurt. They're as tall as this boy over here. And this poor guy right there is a midget. No, he's not. He's normal size. The problem is that he hasn't hit his growth spurt yet. We are born with all the brain cells that we will ever have, about 100 to 200 billion neurons, whose function is to store and transmit information. However, the nervous system continues to grow and develop. Each neural pathway forms thousands of new connections during infancy and toddlerhood. This period of rapid neural growth is called blooming. Neural pathways continue to develop through puberty. The blooming period of neural growth is followed by a period of pruning, where neural connections are reduced. It is thought that pruning causes the brain to function more efficiently, allowing for mastery of more complex skills. Blooming occurs during the first few years of life, and pruning continues through childhood and into adolescence in various areas of the brain. The size of our brain increases rapidly. The brain of a 2-year-old is 55% of its adult size, and by 6 years old, the brain is about 90% of its adult size. During early childhood, ages 3 to 6, the frontal lobes grow rapidly. By the time children reach school age, they are developmentally capable of controlling their attention and behavior. Through the elementary school years, the frontal, temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes grow in size. The brain growth spurts experienced in childhood tend to follow Piaget's sequence of cognitive development, so that significant changes in neural functioning account for cognitive advances. Motor development occurs in an orderly sequence as infants move from reflexive reactions, such, for example, sucking and rooting, to more advanced motor functioning. Babies first learn to hold their heads up, then to sit with assistance, and then to sit unassisted, followed later by crawling and then walking. Motor skills refer to our ability to move our bodies and manipulate objects. Fine motor skills focus on the muscles in our fingers, our toes, and eyes, and enable coordination of small actions, such as grasping a toy, writing with a pencil, and using a spoon. Gross motor skills focus on large muscle groups that control our arms and legs and involve larger movements such as balancing, running, and jumping. As motor skills develop, there are certain developmental milestones that young children should achieve. For each milestone, there is an average age as well as a range of ages in which the milestone should be reached. On average, most babies sit alone at 7 months. Sitting involves both coordination and muscle strength, and 90% of the babies achieve this milestone between 5 and 9 months. Babies on average are able to hold up their head at 6 weeks old, and 90% of babies achieve this between 3 weeks and 4 months old. If a baby is not holding up his head by 4 months old, he is showing a delay. If the child is displaying delays on several milestones, that is reason for concern, and the parent or caregiver should discuss this with the child's pediatrician. Some developmental delays can be identified and addressed through early intervention. Children are expected to reach cognitive milestones. It is helpful to be aware of these milestones as children gain new abilities to think, problem solve, and communicate. Infants shake their head no around 6 to 9 months. They respond to verbal requests to do things like wave bye-bye or blow a kiss around 9 to 12 months. We can expect children to grasp the concept that objects continue to exist even when they are not in sight by around 8 months old. Because toddlers, the 12 to 24-month-olds, have mastered object permanence, they enjoy games like hide and seek, and they realize that when someone leaves the room, they will come back. And this is research done by Loop in 2013. Toddlers also point to pictures in books and look in appropriate places when you ask them to find objects. Preschool-age children, 3 to 5 years old, make steady progress in cognitive development. They count, name colors, and tell you their name and age. They can also make some decisions on their own, such as choosing an outfit to wear. Preschool-age children understand basic time concepts and sequencing, for example, before and after, and they can predict what will happen next in a story. They begin to enjoy the use of humor in stories. Because they can think symbolically, they enjoy pretend play and inventing elaborate characters and scenarios. One of the most common examples of their cognitive growth is their blossoming curiosity. Preschool-age children love to ask why or qué. ¿Qué? That's what she's saying. ¿Qué? That's Spanish for what? For why? Huh? Between 3 and 5 years old, children come to understand that people have thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that are different from their own. This is known as the theory of mind. Children can use this skill to tease others, persuade their parents to purchase a candy bar, or understand why a sibling might be angry. When children develop theory of mind, they can recognize that others have false beliefs. And I can't remember why I put this picture in here, but evidently they understand each other and they're all hugging. All right. All right, good job. Cognitive skills continue to expand in middle and late adulthood, 6 to 11 years of age. Thought processes become more logical and organized when dealing with concrete information. Children at this age understand concepts such as past, present, and future, giving them the ability to plan and work toward goals. They can process complex ideas such as addition and subtraction and cause and effect relationships. However, children's attention spans tend to be very limited until they are around 11 years old. After that point, it begins to improve through adulthood. At about 2 years old, a toddler uses between 50 and 200 words. By 3 years old, they have a vocabulary of up to 1,000 words and can speak in sentences. During the early childhood years, children's vocabulary increases at a rapid pace. This is sometimes referred to as the vocabulary spurt and has been claimed to involve an expansion in vocabulary at a rate of 10 to 20 new words per week. Recent research may indicate that while some children experience these spurts, it is far from universal. It has been estimated that 5-year-olds understand about, let me write this down, I have to fix it. I'm sorry. It has been estimated that 5-year-olds understand 6,000 words, speak 2,000 words, and they understand 6,000, and can define words and question their meanings. They can rhyme and name the days of the week. 7-year-olds speak fluently and use slang and cliches. Attachment is a long-standing connection or bond with others. In Harlow's research with monkeys, this is University of Wisconsin in 1958, he concluded that there was more to the mother-child bond than nourishment. This is Harry Harlow. Feelings of comfort and security are critical components to maternal-infant bonding, which leads to healthy psychosocial development. And this is called contact comfort. This is a picture of a monkey. This is part of his research. They separated newborn monkeys from their mothers. They created these inanimate mothers. One of them was soft and cuddly, and the other fed them. And as you can see, this baby is keeping contact with the soft mother, and it's drinking milk from the hard mother. What they determined was that contact comfort was just as important as sustenance. And you can see that's what's happening in this picture. John Bowlby developed the concept of attachment theory. He defined attachment as the affectional bond or tie that an infant forms with the mother. This is according to Bowlby in 1969. An infant must form this bond with a primary caregiver in order to have a normal social and emotional development. Bowlby proposed that this attachment bond is very powerful and continues throughout life. He used the concept of secure base to define a healthy attachment between parent and child. This is in 1988. At that point, he was not talking about mothers anymore. He was talking about parents. Secure base is a parental presence that gives the child a sense of safety as they explore their surroundings. Bowlby said that two things are needed for a healthy attachment. The caregiver must be responsive to the child's physical, social, and emotional needs, and the caregiver and child must engage in mutually enjoyable interactions. Expanding Bowlby's research, Mary Ainsworth researched other forms of attachment. Ainsworth identified 3 types of parent-child attachments: secure attachment, avoidant attachment, and resistant attachment. A 4th style known as disorganized attachment was later described. The most common type of attachment, also considered the healthiest type of attachment, is called secure attachment. In this type of attachment, the toddler prefers his parent over a stranger. With avoidant attachment, so a secure attachment is the healthiest one, and it's the most abundant one, thank goodness. With avoidant attachment, the child is unresponsive to the parent, does not use the parent as a secure base, and does not care if the parent leaves. Let me explain to you how she came up with this. She did She did research called, what did she call it? Stranger, something about strangers. It had to do with the mother putting the child in a room. There were a bunch of toys in the room, and then the mother leaves. Somebody else comes in, and they try to determine if the child was connected to how connected the child was to the mother is what they were trying to determine. So the stranger situation, or strange situation. And then the mother came back, and they watched how the child interacted with the mother once she came back. So it was a strange situation, as weird as that is. Before the mother came back, a stranger came in. They wanted to see how the child interacted with the stranger. Okay, the toddler reacts to the parent the same way that they react to a stranger. When the parent does return, the child is slow to show a positive reaction. Ainsworth theorized that these children were most likely to have a caregiver who was insensitive and inattentive to their needs. And this is the avoidant attachment. In cases of resistant attachment, the children tend to show clingy behavior, but then they reject the attachment figure's attempts to interact with them. These children do not explore the toys in the room as they are too fearful. During separation in the strange situation, they became extremely disturbed and angry with the parent. When the parent returns, the children are difficult to comfort. Resistant attachment is a result of the caregiver's inconsistent level of response to their child, and this is known as resistant. Children with disorganized attachment behaved oddly in the strange situation. They freeze, run around the room in an erratic manner, or they try to run away when the caregiver returns. This type of attachment is seen most often in kids who have been abused. Research has shown that abuse disrupts a child's ability to regulate their emotions. Just as attachment is the main psychosocial milestone of infancy, the primary psychosocial milestone of childhood is the development of a positive sense of self. Infants don't have a self-concept, which is an understanding of who they are. If you place a baby in front of a mirror, they will reach out to touch their image, thinking it is another baby. And that's what's happening in this to the right. The baby's interacting with itself. By about 18 months, a toddler will recognize that the person in the mirror is themselves. By 24 to 36 months old, children can name and or point to themselves in pictures, clearly indicating self-recognition. Children from 2 to 4 years old will display a great increase in social behavior once they have established a self-concept. They enjoy playing with other children, but they have difficulty sharing their possessions. Through play, children explore and come to understand their gender roles and can label themselves as a girl or boy. By 4 years old, children can cooperate with other children, share when asked, and separate from parents with little anxiety. Children at this age also exhibit autonomy, initiate tasks, and carry out plans. Success in this area contributes to a positive sense of self. Once children reach 6 years old, they can identify themselves in terms of group membership. I'm a first grader. School-age children compare themselves to their peers and discover that they are competent in some areas and less so in others. At this age, children recognize their own personality traits as well as some other traits they would like to have. Development of a positive self-concept is important to healthy development. Children with a positive self-concept tend to be more confident, do better in school, act more independently, and are more willing to try new activities. Formation of a positive self-concept begins in toddlerhood when children establish autonomy and become confident in their abilities. Development of self-concept continues in elementary school when children compare themselves to others. When the comparison is favorable, children feel a sense of competence and are motivated to work harder and accomplish more. Self-concept is reevaluated as teens form an identity. They internalize the messages they have received regarding their strengths and weaknesses, keeping some messages and rejecting others. Adolescents who have achieved identity formation are capable of contributing positively to society. And this is according to research done by Erickson in 1968. Parents can nurture a healthy self-concept, and parenting style may be a factor. The way we parent is an important factor in a child's socio-emotional growth. Baumrind developed and refined a theory describing 4 parenting styles: authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and uninvolved, and it doesn't include being cool. I'm guessing permissiveness has to do with being cool has to do with being permissive. With the authoritative style, the parent gives reasonable demands and consistent limits, expresses warmth and affection, and listens to the child's point of view. Parents set rules and explain the reasons behind them. They are also flexible and willing to make exceptions to the rules in certain cases. Of the 4 parenting styles, the authoritative style is the one that is most encouraged in modern American society. American children raised by authoritative parents tend to have high self-esteem and social skills. However, effective parenting styles vary as a function of culture, and the authoritative style is not necessarily preferred or appropriate in all cultures. The authoritarian style, the parent places high value on conformity and obedience. The parents are often strict, tightly monitor their children, and express little warmth. This style can create anxious, withdrawn, and unhappy kids. However, it is important to point out that authoritarian parenting is as beneficial as the authoritative style in some ethnic groups. First-generation Chinese American children raised by authoritarian parents did just as well in school as their peers who were raised by authoritative parents. For parents who employ permissive style of parenting, the kids run the show and anything goes. Permissive parents make few demands and rarely use punishment. They tend to be very nurturing and loving and may play the role of friend rather than parent. Not surprisingly, children raised by permissive parents tend to lack self-discipline, and the permissive parenting style is negatively associated with grades. The permissive style may also contribute to other risky behaviors such as alcohol abuse, risky sexual behavior, especially among female children, and increased display of disruptive behavior by male children. Positive outcomes associated with children raised by permissive parents: they tend to have higher self-esteem, better social skills, and report lower levels of depression. With the uninvolved style of parenting, the parents are indifferent, uninvolved, and sometimes referred to as neglectful. They don't respond to the child's needs and make relatively few demands. This could be because of severe depression or substance abuse or other factors such as the parent's extreme focus on work. These parents may provide for the child's basic needs, but little else. The children raised in this parenting style are usually emotionally withdrawn, fearful, anxious, perform poorly in school, and are at an increased risk of substance abuse themselves. Temperament refers to innate traits that influence how one thinks, behaves, and reacts with the environment. Children with easy temperaments demonstrate positive emotions, adapt well to change, and are capable of regulating their emotions. Children with difficult temperaments demonstrate negative emotions and have difficulty adapting to change and regulating their emotions. Difficult children are much more likely to challenge parents, teachers, and other caregivers. Therefore, it's possible that easy children, for example, social, adaptable, and easy to soothe, tend to elicit warm and responsive parenting, while demanding, irritable, withdrawn children evoke irritation in their parents or cause their parents to withdraw. Adolescence is a socially constructed concept. In pre-industrial society, children were considered adults when they reached physical maturity, but today we have an extended time between childhood and adulthood called adolescence. Adolescence is the period of development that begins at puberty and ends at emerging adulthood, which is discussed later. In the United States, adolescence is seen as a time to develop independence from parents while remaining connected to them. The typical age range of adolescence is from 12 to 18 years, and this stage of development also has some predictable physical, cognitive, and psychosocial milestones. Adolescence begins with puberty. While the sequence of physical changes in puberty is predictable, the onset and pace of puberty vary widely. Several physical changes occur during puberty, such as adrenarche and gonadarche, the maturing of the adrenal glands and sex glands, respectively. During this time, primary and secondary sexual characteristics develop and mature. Primary sexual characteristics are organs specifically needed for reproduction, like the uterus and ovaries in the females and the testes in the male. Secondary sexual characteristics are physical signs of sexual maturation that do not directly involve sex organs, such as development of breasts and hips in girls, and development of facial hair and a deepened voice in boys. Girls experience menarche, the beginning of menstrual periods, usually around 12 to 13 years old, and boys experience spermarche, the first ejaculation, around 13 and 14 years old. During puberty, both sexes experience a rapid increase in height, for example, growth spurt. For girls, this begins between 8 and 13 years old, with adult height reached between 10 and 16 years old. Boys begin their growth spurt slightly later, usually between 10 and 16 years old, and they reach their adult height between 13 and 17 years old. Both nurture, for example, genes, and nature, for example, genes and nurture, for example, nutrition, medications, and medical conditions, can influence your height. So if you take good care of yourself, you'll reach your optimum height. Probably not in an adult beach, I would imagine. But maybe. Early maturing boys tend to be stronger, taller, and more athletic than their later maturing peers. They're usually more popular, confident, and independent, but they are also at a greater risk for substance abuse and early sexual activity. Early maturing girls may be teased or overtly admired, which can cause them to feel self-conscious about their developing bodies. These girls are at a higher risk for depression, substance abuse, and eating disorders. Late blooming boys and girls, for example, they develop more slowly than their peers, may feel self-conscious about their lack of physical development. Negative feelings are particularly a problem for late maturing boys who are at a higher risk for depression and conflict with parents and more likely to be bullied. The adolescent brain also remains under development. Up until puberty, brain cells continue to bloom in the frontal region. Adolescents engage in increased risk-taking behaviors and emotional outbursts, possibly because the frontal lobes of their brains are still developing. More complex thinking abilities emerge during adolescence. During adolescence, teenagers move beyond concrete thinking and become capable of abstract thought. Teen thinking is characterized by the ability to consider multiple points of view, imagine hypothetical situations, debate ideas and opinions, for example, on politics, religion, and justice, and form new ideas. It's not uncommon for adolescents to question authority or challenge established societal norms. Cognitive empathy, also known as theory of mind, which we discussed earlier with regard to egocentrism, relates to the ability to take the perspective of others and feel concerned for others. Cognitive empathy begins to increase in adolescence and is an important component of social problem solving and conflict avoidance. According to one longitudinal study, levels of cognitive empathy begin rising in girls around 13 years old and around 15 years old in boys. Teens who reported having supportive fathers with whom they could discuss their worries were found to be better able to take perspectives of others. Adolescents continue to refine their sense of self as they relate to others. Some adolescents adopt the values and rules of their parents, expect them for them. Other teens develop identities that are in opposition to their parents but align with a peer group. This is common as peer relationships become a central focus in adolescents' lives. As adolescents work to form their identities, they pull away from their parents and the peer group becomes very important. Despite spending less time with their parents, most teens report positive feelings toward them. Warm and healthy parent-child relationships have been associated with positive child outcomes, such as better grades and fewer school behavior problems in the United States as well as in other countries. Emerging adulthood is a relatively newly defined period of lifespan development, spanning from 18 years old to the mid-20s, characterized as an in-between time where identity exploration is focused on work and love. In the United States, you are legally considered an adult at 18 years old. But other definitions of adulthood vary widely. In sociology, for example, a person may be considered an adult when they become self-supporting, choose a career, get married, or start a family. The ages at which we achieve these milestones vary from person to person, as well as from culture to culture. And if you notice what's going on here, this guy is thinking that he's flirting with this lady, and the answer is it's a guy. Ooh. It seems that emerging adulthood is a product of both Western culture and our current times. People in developed countries are living longer, allowing the freedom to take an extra decade to start a career and family. Changes in the workforce also play a role. 50 years ago, a young adult with a high school diploma could immediately enter the workforce and climb the corporate ladder. This is no longer the case. Bachelor's and even graduate degrees are required more and more often, even for entry-level jobs. And of course, this is kind of a joke, I guess. You'd be surprised. I think he thought that the guy was a female. That's kind of funny. Adulthood begins around 20 years old and has three distinct stages: early, middle, and late. Each stage brings its own set of rewards and challenges. By the time we reach early adulthood, 20 to early 40s, our physical maturation is complete, although our height and weight may increase slightly. In young adulthood, our physical abilities are at their peak, including muscle strength, reaction time, sensory abilities, and cardiac functioning. Many women have children in their young adulthood years, so they may see additional weight gain and breast changes. Okay, one of the things that we need to talk about is your cognitive ability. When do you get your adult brain? And the answer is, just because you've gone through puberty doesn't mean that you have an adult brain. Your brain doesn't completely mature until you're in your middle 20s, around age 25. That's when you have your adult brain. Before that, not so much. You still have a teenage brain, or an adolescent brain, I guess. Middle adulthood extends from the 40s to the 60s. Physical decline is gradual. The skin loses its some elasticity, and wrinkles among the first signs of aging. Wrinkles are among the first. He thinks he's short, so he's trying to jump up. Visual acuity decreases. That's John Stewart. Visual acuity decreases during this time. Women experience a gradual decline in fertility as they approach the onset of menopause, the end of the menstrual cycle, around 50 years old. Both men and women tend to gain weight in the abdominal area for men and in the hips and thighs for women. Hair begins to thin and turn gray, and that's what's happening with John Stewart. If I grew a beard right now, it'd be pure white. then again, I'm old. Late adulthood is considered to extend from the 60s on. This is the last stage of physical change. I'm there. I'm 71 years old. The skin continues to lose elasticity, reaction time slows further, and muscle strength diminishes. Not with me. Smell, taste, hearing, and vision so sharp in their 20s decline significantly. The brain may also no longer function at optimal levels, leading to problems like memory loss, dementia, and Alzheimer's disease in later years. Unlike our physical abilities, which peak in our mid-20s and then begin a slow decline, that's what I just said, our peak intelligence, our adult brain hits about age 25. Our cognitive abilities remain steady throughout early and middle adulthood. Our crystallized intelligence, information skills, and strategies we have gathered through a lifetime of experience tends to hold steady as we age. It may even improve. In late adulthood, we begin to experience a decline in another area of our cognitive abilities, our fluid intelligence, information processing abilities, reasoning, and memory. These processes become slower. Research has found adults who engage in mentally and physically stimulating activities experience less cognitive decline and have a reduced incidence of mild cognitive impairment and dementia. So either use it or lose it. We're talking about your brain here. So there you go. And then positive relationships with significant others in our adult years have been found to contribute to a state of well-being. Most adults in the United States identify themselves through their relationships with their family, particularly with spouses, children, and parents. While raising children can be stressful, especially when they are young, research suggests that parents reap the rewards down the road, as adult children tend to have a positive effect on parental well-being. Having a stable marriage has also been found to contribute to well-being throughout adulthood. Death marks the end of our life story. Our culture and individual backgrounds influence how we view death. In some cultures, death is accepted as a natural part of life and is embraced. Until about 50 years ago in the United States, a doctor might inform someone that they were dying, and the majority of deaths occurred in the hospital. Today, hospice provides care for 1.65 million Americans and their families. Because of hospice care, many terminally ill people are able to spend their last days at home. Research has indicated that hospice care is beneficial for the patient and for the patient's family. Hospice patients report high levels of satisfaction with hospice care because they are able to remain at home and are not completely dependent on strangers for care. Hospice patients tend to live longer than non-hospice patients. Family members receive emotional support and are regularly informed of their loved one's treatment and condition. The family member's burden of care is also reduced. Both the patient and the patient's family members report increased family support, increased social support, and improved coping while receiving hospice services. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969, Kubler-Ross, who worked with the founders of hospice care, described the process of an individual accepting their own death. She proposed 5 stages of grief. The first stage is denial. I'm not dying. You guys must be crazy. You must have the wrong specimen. So they're in denial. The second stage is anger. The third stage is bargaining. Fourth stage is depression. And the last stage, of course, is acceptance. Most individuals experience these stages, but the stages may occur in different orders depending on the individual. A person might write a living will or advance directive, which is a written legal document that details specific interventions a person wants. A person may also include a do not resuscitate, a DNR order, and they would share this with their family and close friends. A DNR order states that if a person stops breathing or their heart stops beating, medical personnel, such as doctors and nurses, are not to take steps to revive or resuscitate the patient. A living will can also include a healthcare proxy, which appoints a specific person to make medical decisions for you if you are unable to speak for yourself. Now, usually this goes to your spouse, but if your spouse has another problem, such as dementia, then that can't possibly happen. People's desire for living wills and DNRs are often influenced by their religion, their culture, and their upbringing. And that is the end of the chapter. So I'll see you guys next week.